This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA. AASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Really exciting things are happening over at AASA at the moment. In particular, AASA has announced a suite of new prizes for animal studies scholars. So if you are undertaking animal studies work and you like to win prizes, including cash prizes, go over to the AASA website and check out what's on offer. Now, this episode is also brought to you by the lovely people at Animal Publics. Animal Publics is part of the University of Sydney Press, and Animal Publics is dedicated to publishing books that are focused on animal studies issues. They have a lot of books already published as part of their Animal Publics imprint, and there's many more to come. So I suggest you check out Animal Publics and have a think about ordering some of the books on offer for your university library. That way it's available for everyone to read and enjoy. Well, look, it's so exciting to be back in the driver's seat. I think we can all agree that Josh is doing an absolutely fantastic job, but I'm going to drop in and do a couple of guest episodes along the way. And in particular, I'm going to do episodes with people who I've known for a long time and animal studies scholars that I've, in a sense, grown up with in Australia. And indeed, people who I've probably been pestering for a very long time to come on the podcast, and I finally convinced them. So this episode, we're joined by Dr. Rick DeVos. Rick is an adjunct at Curtin University and his research is focused on the anthropogenic extinction. We're going to learn all about what that is. And today we're going to discuss his piece, A Triumphal Entry, A Stifled Cry, A Hushed Retreat. This is a very sophisticated piece that's quite frankly probably too intellectually complex for me, but Rick's going to explain it all. And this appeared in a collection that was published by Routledge in May 2021. And we've got to give a shout out to, the collection was called Life Writing in the Anthropocene, and we've got to acknowledge the editors, which were Jessica White and Gillian Whitlock. So welcome to the podcast, Rick.
Thank you, Siobhan. I'm a long-time listener, but first-time speaker, and I'm very honoured and excited to be here with you.
Rick, could you start by telling us what it was that led you to do this work?
My background, I guess I started off in theatre and drama and performance studies. So I've, come into animal studies quite late in life, I guess, but most of my work in anthropogenic extinction is trying to come to grips with recovering something of the lives of groups of animals that have disappeared. And so a lot of my work consists of journal articles and book chapters tracing particular lives across themes such as movement, sensing humans and attention to seasons and time and that kind of thing. But this particular paper, A Triumphal Entry, A Stifled Cry, A Hushed Retreat, was really something different. I tried to do something a little different because I wanted to capture something I normally felt that I wasn't doing. So what I wanted to do was convey this underlying set of feelings surrounding two acts of killing described in the field notes of an American specimen collector, Charles Macaulay Hoy. One of those encounters is better known than the other because it led to the Baiiji, or Yangtze River dolphin, entering the realm of Western scientific knowledge. So, as a teenager, Charles Hoy was visiting his Christian missionary parents in the Hunan province in China in 1914 and went out duck hunting with local villagers on Dongting Lake, which is a flood basin of the Yangtze River. And as this small group of Yangtze River dolphins, of baiji, swam by, Hoy took a shot and hit one, causing the dolphin to cry out loudly. And the dolphin was killed by the shot and brought to shore by the villagers, who cooked and ate the dolphin, the baiji. Hoy kept the skull and 2 cervical vertebrae from the baiji, and he cleaned them up and brought them back to the US when he returned. And he went to Washington and met the zoologist Garrett Millett Jr. at the US Natural History Museum, and he sold him the baiji's remains. And these became the material artifacts that introduced the baiji to Western science as a new and distinct species of river dolphin. So that was the first encounter. The second encounter took place 5 years later in Northern Australia, in Queensland. Hoy had received training as a specimen collector by Garrett Miller, and he was sent to Australia on a collecting expedition. The US Natural History Museum expressed this fear that as Australian animals were feared to become extinct, the museum would have no records or specimens of these animals. So Hoy was dispatched, and he's, as a young man, he was 21 or 22, he stayed for 3 years, traveling around the country, making his own way, getting advice and information from local Aboriginal people, from farmers and hunters, as well as from museums and mammal experts. And while he was there, he was looking for platypus near Ravenshoe in the Atherton Tablelands. And he reported on observing a couple of platypus mating close to a riverbank. And he watched them, observed them, then shot the female, and then the male hissed and lunged at him. And obviously, this took Hoy by surprise, but we gather from his notes that he then shot the male. And I guess from reading both those accounts, what struck me was that it was the way they were recorded, really, as scientific field notes. And I felt that the wail of the baiji and the anguished hiss of the platypus both interrupted Hoy's narrative, the way that he presented these facts, by introducing another perspective and agent in the story, something that went against this kind of dispassionate, objective description. The Smithsonian Institution archives allowed me electronic access to Hoy's field notes and his diaries and correspondence, which allowed me to flesh out a better sense of the context in which Hoy was writing, and as well match baiji and platypus, which Hoy shot with the specimens held in the museum's specimen collection. And I felt that there was an emotional element to these two encounters, which was, and what was lost was the perspectives of the platypus and the baiji, and this kind of stuck in my mind. And I thought, just from the way the wail of the dolphin and the hiss of the platypus, what they described, these provided clues to this particular encounter by reading through the notes. So I tried some years ago to explore this in a conference paper in 2014. It was a literature and environment conference in Canberra. I'm not sure if you remember, Siobhan, but you were a plenary speaker at the conference.
I do remember very well, absolutely.
But in my paper, I felt that I still didn't capture either the poignancy of those two incidents or a real sense of the lives of the animals who had to make sense of what were lethal encounters. So a couple of years ago, I was contacted by Jessica White, who's a very talented writer and researcher, as she was compiling a life writing collection addressing the Anthropocene. And upon a suggestion by Dr. Claire Archer Lean, who is a mutual friend of ours, Siobhan, and also a former guest on Knowing Animals.
Yes, and a very talented writer.
Yes. I, Jessica asked if I might consider contributing to the volume, and I thought this was a good opportunity to tackle the question of the Baiji, the platypus, and Charles Hoy again, but this time by way of creative non-fiction, which again is not my forte. Because of my background, I have quite a lot of experience in script writing, but not in more descriptive creative writing. So in this particular piece, I attempt to frame the life of Hoy and his actions, his two actions of killing, within the imagined lives and perspectives of the platypus and the Baiji. With the Baiji, I also try to speak in a different way about extinction, not just as it's practiced or perpetrated, but how it might be experienced as a slow and painful process. And yeah, I guess I've got to say I really benefited from the suggestions of Jessica in terms of how to make the piece critical as well as creative, as well as how to make the voices of the platypus and the Baiji distinctive within the piece.
Yeah, look, it is a really fascinating, and I have to also say, to me, a moving and poignant piece. And I really encourage everyone listening to go and have a read, because I know that in this discussion, we're not going to be able to capture the beauty of the prose and the way you kind of take us into the lives of these non-human animals. I think it's really beautifully done. And one of the things that happened when I was reading Claire's work is I completely mistook which animal she was kind of embodying and writing about for one of her early pieces. I really thought it was a lion, but of course it was a kangaroo. And so with your piece, I thought, look, just wait. You don't really know what's going on. But then after a while, of course, it became very clear that we're talking about this really amazing, unique Australian animal, you know, the platypus, and we really get into their lives. One of the things that I found most kind of challenging about your piece was that you write that even by 1919, there was concern that native Australian animals were perhaps at risk of extinction, yet at the same time, they're actively being killed. Did you have some thoughts on that kind of paradigm?
That is part of the history of the way I guess extinction is made sense of and discovered. It's partly that museums and collectors, you know, often have a panic around that idea about what extinction means and the need to have artifacts, what they, you know, to actually own the knowledge and to own the evidence of rare animals and extinction. And you know, that is part of that practice. And I think it has to do with I say it's a colonial history. I'm not sure if others might have other ways of describing it, but it's about that notion that hunting is a way of knowing animals. It's that idea that hunters express that idea that if you want, you know, you have to share time and space with animals to get to know them. So that becomes a history that these days is obviously questioned and widely refuted, but it is part of our history anyway. It's part of the history of museums and of scientific institutions.
Yeah, you make this really fascinating observation that it had never occurred to me, even though it was hiding in plain sight, that, you know, species and specimens are these very connected concepts, and, you know, even the way in which we deploy language. Do you know, when did that kind of moment occur to you that you realise that these concepts are so linked?
Really, it was probably something that came out fairly early, because of, my background, I guess, is in post-colonial studies as well, but, my theoretical background. So, and it's partly that idea of the way in which, specific, ideal objects in general and their exemplars in real life differ from each other. And for me, therefore, often specimens and species have different logics. There's a different way of describing them. And if you're looking at extinction, it makes a little more sense, or becomes starkly clear in the fact that, a species, in the way that, and people's obsession with classifying non-human animals according to species taxonomies, there's a sense that that knowledge fits a pattern which tends towards the universal. But when you're looking at extinct animals, ways of life and what's typical about animals might have already disappeared long before the last animals have disappeared.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And so, we're left in this quandary that we arrive at so many times, I think, in animal studies, which is that we find the act of, collecting these specimens morally very problematic, yet we also learn a great deal from that. And we land in that position in so many ways, including when we think about zoos and blah. How do you reconcile that, the desire to know and understand and have access, and the impact that has on the animals?
Partly, well, I think, my way of thinking through it is about what you can know and what you can't know. You have to live with non-human animals, you have to respect their difference, but also respect their space and time. So you can't know everything, and that desire to know everything is a very entitled attitude to have anyway. And I'm thinking, I think at the moment every day, because I like to go out bushwalking regularly, and I can't do that, obviously, during a period of lockdown here in Melbourne. But I think about the space that it provides for animals. And I look at national parks close by, like Churchill National Park. But also I'm thinking of Arthur's Seat at the moment, which is threatened by, a talk of a quarry that's being planned by the Ross's Trust. And seeing the animals that are there, at night, I've been around there and seen koalas going from tree to tree or whatever, and knowing that these really are endangered, Australian animals, and yet there's a space there that we have desires to get rid of in order to make money. So, but I think what we're not doing is providing that space. And I think with knowledge too, we can't know everything. We can't own everything. We can't, take control and possession of every animal we have to let go and set limits to what we can know, and be a little more humble and respectful about that.
Yeah, being a bit humble isn't what we're best at. So, Rick, as we've already noted, you have a very particular, or you deploy a very particular style in this piece. Can you tell listeners a little bit about why it works for you in terms of what you want to convey, to have both kind of to tell us the story of the animal, and then also link it in with the analysis of the historical artifacts, and you also include images, which was probably quite expensive and difficult to convince the publishers to include. Why those different modes?
It was part of the archival research. I guess I wanted to show the end result of these encounters, or show what was left of them, and to take them, to read them in a particular way. And that was because we look at those, and for field scientists and zoologists looking at those exhibits, what might be important are those morphological features relating to taxonomy, to what a male platypus looks like in relation to a female, if there are subspecific details attached to those in terms of the platypus. And for the Baiji, it may more have to do with the historical significance of this rare specimen. But I wanted to place them in the piece in relation to the stories that were being told by me, or, in terms of voicing the perspectives of a platypus Baiji, and I guess in part Hoy himself. So it was, and they actually, there was no cost to me at all. The Smithsonian Institution was very kind in terms of allowing, as long as they had some details that it was being published in an academic context, they were quite happy to provide electronic copies of the photographs. So I was very lucky that way. And, the photographer Donald Hurlbert spoke with me about what exactly I wanted, what they should look like, the background and that kind of thing. So they were extremely generous with that, and I'm very grateful to them for that.
Oh, how wonderful. Well, that's fantastic. That's so pleasing to hear. Now, Rick, I really want to talk to you about a book that you're working on that I know is going to come out fairly soon, although in book terms that can be quite a distance of time. But we'll save that for the end. Now I'd like to ask you the very important question, which is, everyone who comes on the podcast is asked 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I'll just take a quick breath. Okay, I'm ready.
Now you're ready. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I hadn't thought about it for a while, but I can, because it was quite an impact in the field I was working with at the time. It was a journal article in Theatre magazine in 1994 called "There Must Be a Lot of Fish in That Lake Toward an Ecological Theatre" by Erna Chowdhury.
Oh,
and
really?
Yes, you're quite familiar with yourself. And it was a follow-up piece. She'd written a piece a couple of years earlier, 1992, called "Animal Rights Performing Beyond the Human." And this took it a bit further. And it was a piece about, it was a critique of the way we use realism and naturalism in theatre, and the way in which nature is portrayed in a theatre, in terms of these conventions of naturalism, which actually, as a result, erased real nature and real animals. Animals almost always became signs or metaphors for something else, and didn't actually have that sense of agency or reality that humans had. And she kind of pushed this idea, and it, looking back since then, it is a much cited piece of work, because it got a lot of people thinking about theatre in relation to ecology, and it voiced other people's work in relation to it. And it pushed that idea of the fact that theatre, and especially its liberal humanist tradition, can promote a kind of ignorance of real nature and real animals.
Fascinating. Oh, that's so wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, I can. It was called "Extinction Stories Performing Absences," in a book with edited by Philip Armstrong and Lawrence Simmons, entitled "Knowing Animals," which I think is a wonderful name.
Wow.
And it was this piece was based on 2 conferences papers I gave, one in 2002 at a theatre conference, and I was looking at the idea of the way that thylacines were performed after their announced extinction, how they were invoked in art and theatre. And then I compared that with the way that they were displayed by zoos while thylacines were still extant or, believed to be around. And it wasn't a great paper. I don't know, I didn't have it well organised. I learnt from it. And then the next year, I delivered a paper for a cultural studies conference in Christchurch, and it was a more critically framed piece. It looked at extinction stories and their philosophical and colonial dimensions. And through that, in the audience was Philip Armstrong, who introduced himself, talked about his work, and invited me to submit the paper. And quite a few years later, it was published in that volume.
Oh, how wonderful. That's fantastic. I mean, I do feel terribly guilty about, all the travel I've done in my life. I think it's probably morally wrong, but it is kind of, there is something about being in the same room as people and having all these kind of side conversations that is very intellectually stimulating and creates opportunities that, you kind of don't get, over Zoom.
I think, yeah, he really, it was opening up a new world to me, the idea that animals, those kind of post-colonial contexts for thinking about animals was possible.
Yeah, lovely. Well, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Okay. Oh, that's such a tough question. I come from a background. I come from a background where I work with concepts, and it's concepts that generally tend to inspire me more than people. And I've just mentioned Philip Armstrong. Philip and Fiona Probyn-Rapsey are two people who've given me opportunities, after long periods of rejections by many outlets and conferences and publications. So they have opened up the world to me. But if I was to say one person who got me started, it was probably, I hate to say it, but a less well-known scholar called Rob Lambert, who for the last, I don't know how many, at least 15, 16 years has worked at Nottingham University. But for a period of time, he was a senior honorary research fellow at University of Western Australia. And he gave a lecture, like a prestigious guest lecture on contested nature in the modern British countryside. And through that, I also read his book, Species History in Scotland. And in it, at a time where I really didn't, I saw myself as somebody who wrote about extinction, but was only just beginning to learn about animal studies. That, a friend of mine, Matt Trellew, has just gave me lots of readings and talked about animal studies as a discipline at the time. But reading Rob's work and listening to him, the way he talked about the ambiguity in the way we think about invasive species, introduced species and native species, and different people's responses to them. He took a geographical and sociological perspective in talking about them. I thought, this is great. He works with people, he works with animals, and he does work in the field as well as critical work. It was the first time that it entered my mind that there is something for me here. There is an academic pathway here. It may not be exactly his, but I guess he sowed that seed of how to make a life for yourself in relation to animals and the academy.
Oh, how lovely. Well, what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I've probably alluded to it. This is what I think anyway, is as academics, we have a lot of pressure to produce knowledge and to own that knowledge. And in our research and findings, to be clear and conclusive. But I think what we can do better is to give animals more space and time in our work. And make clearer what animal knowledge is, the fact that non-human animals possess unbounded and very diverse knowledge that we tend to ignore in order to get our views across. So spaces and times where animals can be listened to or have a chance to speak is something that's important, but it's very difficult. And I certainly don't have definitive answers how this can be done, but I know it involves respecting animal abilities, animal strengths, animal potentials, and to think about academics and animals as sites of difference. Not all academics the same, not all animals are the same, and we need to probably make that notion of humans and those ideas of humans and those notions of animals and animal ways of being much more diverse and much more different as they are, rather than trying to draw things together to make it, I guess, more universal.
Wonderful. Well, if you had the power to change one thing about the human, non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Rather than, well, obviously I thought about that and thought about making non-human animals masters of the world, but rather I'm thinking more about relationships being more inclusive and equitable. And I guess I have, before I thought about knowing animals and speaking with you, I didn't realize how much I used the word respectful, but I guess that's part of it in that fact that the more we think about non-human animals as individuals, as people, as possessing the same personhood that each of us humans do, then those relationships can be more inclusive and more equitable.
Wonderful. Well, Rick, what are you working on next?
It's funny you should ask, because at the moment, what I'm working on at the moment is a collection for Sydney University Press entitled Unsettling Subjects and Decolonizing Animals.
Wow.
And I'm working with some wonderful scholars within that to put together a set of papers looking at subjects such as the way non-human animals have been affected by and respond to historical and ongoing colonial structures and processes, and the ways in which colonial ways of knowing have been questioned, both by Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars, and the way in which humans have engaged with and represented animals in the work has been very much influenced by colonial ways. So looking at ways of resisting that. It's certainly not a manifesto to suddenly think, right, we are now decolonial or we've decolonized or whatever, but actually trying to look at the problem and finding a way through it. So part of that, by that title, Unsettling Subjects and Decolonizing Animals, the chapters look at things such as the way non-human animals question, by their behaviour and responses, question the norms of settler colonialism, and the way in which they are sometimes colonial subjects, acquiescent and complicit, but at other times quite resistive and challenging. And the way that understanding this can help resist sometimes our perceptions of our colonial lives and the way in which we see ourselves in relation to that. And this is, it's one of those things that it's harder than you think if we think about animal studies scholars and just academics in general, the way they must survive and work with colonial institutions, such as the academy itself.
Oh, it's a great challenge. It's so hard, and I'm so grateful that you're taking important steps towards helping us do this, particularly in relation to animal studies. I sense it's going to be a very important book. I can't wait to get my hands on a copy. So how can people find out more about your work?
Um, I've recently, I've got a staff profile. I'm an adjunct at Curtin University in Western Australia. So I have a staff profile there. But I've recently also got a personal website called, it's all in lowercase, richtdevos.net, which provides some information about what I'm doing and what I'm working on. So I think that's probably the best way, and hopefully, I think more people will do that now that I've become a guest on Knowing Animals.
Well, Rick, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Oh, Siobhan, look, I'm very grateful, it has been a pleasure for me too.
Thank you. The only disappointment is that we can't do it face to face, but
It
maybe
would have been
it would have been lovely, but hopefully we'll catch up sometime soon. So yes. Thank you, Rick, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now you can follow us all over the socials. We've got a Knowing Animals Twitter account. We've got also our own kind of Instagram account. And well, actually, we don't have a Knowing Animals Instagram account, but you can follow me personally. And we're, of course, on Facebook. So we're all over the socials. Look out for us. And as we always say here, we do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.